Security told a single mom she didn't belong at her own son's graduation, but then 7 secret agents appeared, and everything changed. Discover the story that left an entire crowd speechless. Margaret O'Brien sat in the last row of the prestigious Chicago National Academy Auditorium, her weathered fingers clutching a small wrinkled purse and a faded photograph of her son Daniel as a baby. The photo's edges were worn smooth from years of touching a talisman she carried through countless sleepless nights. Her navy blouse was carefully ironed, despite the frayed cuffs, and her black shoes, the same ones she'd worn to job interviews, for the past 5 years, were polished to hide their age. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across the sea of expensive suits and military dress uniforms surrounding her, making her feel like a shadow in a room full of spotlights. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation, as proud families filled the seats, their conversations peppered with talk of summer homes and military connections. Margaret kept her eyes forward, focusing on the stage where her son would soon receive his diploma from one of the nation's most elite military academies. This moment had cost her everything: dignity, warmth, countless meals. But as she watched the graduates filing in, she knew every sacrifice had been worth it. The morning had started like any other in her small studio apartment on the South Side. Margaret had pressed her one good outfit with an iron that sputtered and threatened to die, just like everything else in her life. She'd caught 3 buses to reach the academy, counting and recounting the crumpled bills in her purse to ensure she had enough for the return trip. The invitation in her hand was pristine, carefully protected in a plastic sleeve, the only proof. She belonged in this world of privilege and power. But belonging, she was about to learn, required more than an invitation. As she settled into her seat, adjusting her purse strap nervously, she noticed the sideways glances from other attendees. Their eyes swept over her worn clothing and modest appearance with the kind of dismissive assessment she'd grown accustomed to over the years. She straightened her shoulders, reminding herself that she had every right to be here. More right than most, considering what she'd sacrificed to get Daniel this far. The graduates began their processional, and Margaret's heart swelled as she spotted Daniel in his crisp ceremonial uniform. At 22, he carried himself with the confidence she'd worked so hard to instill in him despite their circumstances. His shoulders were squared, his chin lifted, and for a moment she saw not the academy cadet but the little boy who used to ask why they couldn't afford the toys other children had. She'd learned to answer those questions with stories about dreams and determination rather than apologies about poverty. Then came the voice that would shatter her world like glass hitting concrete. "Ma'am, this area is for family only. You need to leave." 2 security guards materialized beside her row, their presence imposing, and their voices carrying the authority of those accustomed to being obeyed without question. Their eyes performed the same dismissive scan she'd endured from the other guests, but this time it came with the power to act on their judgment. Margaret's throat constricted, as if invisible hands were squeezing her windpipe. Around her, conversations died as perfectly coiffed heads turned to observe the spectacle. Some whispered behind manicured hands, others simply stared with the detached curiosity reserved for minor disruptions. The weight of their collective gaze pressed down on her like a physical force, making her small frame seem to shrink even further into the plush auditorium seat. "I am family," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the fierce certainty of a mother's love. "I'm his mother." She gestured toward Daniel, who hadn't yet noticed the commotion brewing in the back rows. Her hand trembled, slightly, as she pointed, the gesture both protective and pleading. One of the guards sighed with the exaggerated patience of someone dealing with a recurring problem. His partner shifted impatiently, already reaching for his radio. "Look, we've had issues with people sneaking in here," the first guard said, his tone suggesting he delivered this speech before. "Please don't make this harder than it has to be." Margaret blinked hard, her eyes burning with the effort of holding back tears that threatened to expose her vulnerability to this room full of strangers. They couldn't see the nights she'd worked double shifts at the diner, coming home with swollen feet and the smell of grease in her hair. Also, Daniel could have new textbooks. They couldn't know about the birthdays she'd celebrated alone, sending him care packages instead of asking him to come home, because she knew his studies were more important than her loneliness. The memories flooded through her mind like a slideshow. Of sacrifice the winter she'd worn 3 sweaters instead of turning on the heat. The countless meals of crackers and peanut butter so Daniel could have proper nutrition the night she'd sewn patches on his clothes by candlelight to save on electricity. Every choice had been measured against his future. Every dollar stretched until it screamed every moment of maternal pride swallowed to fuel his ambition rather than her own need for recognition. From the stage, Daniel stood tall and proud, unaware that the woman who had stitched together his future with bleeding fingers and unwavering determination was being told she didn't belong at its culmination. His ceremonial uniform caught the stage lights, transforming him into the embodiment of everything she'd dreamed he could become. The irony wasn't lost on her. The very achievement that proved she belonged here was being used as evidence that she didn't. The security guard reached for her elbow, his grip firm but not yet forceful. Margaret felt her world tilting, the moment she'd anticipated for months, dissolving into humiliation and rejection. This was supposed to be her victory lap, the public acknowledgement that her sacrifices had meaning. Instead, it was becoming another reminder of her place in a world that valued appearance over substance, wealth over worth. But then something extraordinary happened. 7 men moved through the crowd like shadows given form, their presence immediately shifting the energy in the room. They weren't in uniform, but their bearing was unmistakably military. Broad shoulders that spoke of discipline, clean, haircuts that suggested active service, and sharp eyes that assessed and catalogued everything within their field of vision. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as these silent sentinels positioned themselves around Margaret's row. One stepped forward, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command. "Is there a problem here?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, polite in its phrasing, but unmistakable in its intent. The security guards hesitated, suddenly uncertain in the face of this unexpected development. "This woman doesn't have the proper credentials," one guard stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. The words sounded hollow, now exposed for the arbitrary discrimination they represented. Another of the 7 men spoke, his voice calm but carrying an edge that suggested consequences for the wrong answer. "She doesn't need credentials. She has a son who earned his place here. That makes her family. That makes her the most important family." The statement landed with the finality of a gavel, transforming the debate from one of rules to one of recognition. The crowd began to murmur a low susurrus of confusion and growing awareness. The guards froze like deer caught in headlights suddenly, understanding they had stepped into something far more complex than a simple security issue. Margaret stared at these unexpected protectors, trying to process what was happening, as her world shifted from nightmare back toward dream. The tallest of the 7 men turned to Margaret with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the steel. He'd shown the guards. "Your son once saved a friend of ours during a training mission," he said, his voice soft enough that only she could hear. "He told us about you, how you raised him with nothing but love and strength. We've been waiting to meet you." Margaret's lips parted in surprise, her hand instinctively moving to her heart as if to catch it before it could leap from her chest. Daniel had mentioned friends from the academy in his letters, but she'd never imagined they knew about her, much less that they understood the depth of her sacrifice. The realization that her son spoke of her with pride to his peers sent a warm flood of emotion through her chest. On the stage, Daniel finally noticed the commotion. His head turned toward the back of the auditorium, and when he realized what was happening, his face went pale beneath his cadet's cap. Without hesitation, he broke from his formation and marched down the aisle with the purposeful stride of a soldier on a mission. His eyes were bright with unshed tears, and his jaw was set with the kind of determination Margaret recognized from their most difficult years. He came to stand before the security guards, his uniform lending him an authority that transcended his 22 years. When he spoke, his voice carried across the suddenly silent auditorium like a bell. "She's not just my mother," he said, his words clear and unwavering. "She's the reason I'm standing here. Without her, there is no me." The silence that followed was complete and profound, as if the entire auditorium had collectively drawn breath and forgotten to exhale. Then, like a dam bursting, applause erupted, fierce, raw, and unfiltered. Even those who had looked at Margaret with disdain moments before now clapped with tears in their eyes and bowed heads. The sound washed over her like a benediction, transforming her shame into something approaching triumph. Have you ever experienced or known someone who has experienced something similar? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The Academy's commanding officer, a stern man with silver hair and campaign ribbons covering his chest, stepped forward. His face was visibly moved as he surveyed the scene, taking in the protective circle of agents, the defiant graduate, and the small woman at the center of it all. "This ceremony doesn't begin," he announced, in a voice that carried to every corner of the auditorium, "until this woman is seated in the front row where she belongs." The security guards stepped aside as if released from a spell, their faces flushed with embarrassment. The 7 agents formed an honor guard around Margaret, escorting her down the aisle as conversations resumed in hushed, respectful tones. Her legs felt unsteady, but their presence gave her strength. With each step toward the front of the auditorium, she felt herself transforming from an intruder into an honored guest. Her new seat in the front row offered a perfect view of the stage, and Margaret settled into it with hands that still trembled as she clutched the baby photo tighter. The edges were now damp from her tears, but they were tears of joy rather than humiliation. Around her she could feel the changed atmosphere. Where once there had been dismissal and judgment, now there was respect and understanding. But would this recognition be enough to heal years of struggle and self-doubt? The ceremony was about to begin, and Margaret sensed that the most important moments were yet to come. When Daniel's name was called and he walked across the stage to receive his diploma, the auditorium erupted in applause. But instead of saluting the crowd or his commanding officers as protocol, demanded he turn to face his mother in the front row. His hand rose in a sharp, precise salute, not to the Academy, not to the flag, but to the woman who had made his achievement possible. The gesture sent a ripple of emotion through the crowd. Margaret pressed the baby photo to her chest, feeling her heart expand until she thought it might burst. This was the moment she had dreamed of during those long nights, when hope seemed as distant as the stars. Her son, resplendent in his uniform and surrounded by the trappings of his achievement, was publicly acknowledging that her sacrifices had meaning. The commanding officer approached the microphone, his usual stern demeanor softened by emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system, "today we've witnessed something that reminds us why we serve. This young man's success didn't happen in a vacuum. It was built on the foundation of a mother's unwavering dedication and sacrifice." As the ceremony concluded and families began to gather on the floor for photographs, the 7 agents approached. Margaret again. The tallest one, who had first spoken in her defense, extended his hand. "Mrs. O'Brien, your son is a credit to you and to the service. We're honored to have met you." The others nodded in agreement, each taking a moment to shake her hand and express their respect. Daniel finally reached her, his dress uniform impeccable but his eyes bright with emotion. He gathered her into a fierce embrace, lifting her slightly off the ground despite her protests about wrinkles in his uniform. "Mom," he whispered against her ear, "I'm so sorry that happened. You deserve to be here more than anyone." Margaret pulled back to cup his face in her weathered hands, seeing past the military bearing to the little boy who used to crawl into her bed during thunderstorms. "You have nothing to apologize for," she said firmly. "This day is perfect because you're perfect, and you've made me prouder than you'll ever know." As photographers captured their reunion, Margaret realized that the humiliation she'd endured had transformed into something beautiful. The other families approached them, introducing themselves and expressing admiration for Daniel's achievements and her dedication. Conversations that might have been stilted by class differences flowed naturally, connected by the universal understanding of parental love and sacrifice. The 7 agents lingered nearby, and Margaret learned that they were graduates of the Academy themselves, now serving in various capacities around the world. They had heard Daniel's stories about his mother during late-night conversations in the barracks, and her reputation had spread among them like legend. To them, she wasn't a poor woman who didn't belong. She was a hero whose battlefield had been daily life, whose victories had been measured in her son's success. As the afternoon wore on and the crowds began to thin, Margaret found herself surrounded by new friends and unexpected allies. The commanding officer's wife, an elegant woman who had initially looked right through her, now insisted on exchanging contact information. "I'd love to hear more about how you managed to raise such an exceptional young man," she said with genuine interest. The Academy's chaplain, who had delivered the ceremony's invocation, approached with tears in his eyes. "Mrs. O'Brien, your story today reminded us all what real strength looks like. Would you consider speaking at our next parents' orientation? I think our incoming families could learn something valuable from your experience." Margaret looked around at the sea of faces. Military personnel, proud parents, academy staff, all looking at her with respect and admiration. The woman who had entered the auditorium feeling like an imposter was leaving as a recognized hero. The transformation seemed impossible, yet here she was standing in the center of a circle of love and acceptance. Daniel appeared at her elbow, having finally finished his official duties. "Ready to go home, Mom?" he asked, offering her his arm like a proper gentleman. But Margaret hesitated, looking around at the scene one more time. Home would always be that small studio apartment on the south side, but today had expanded her world, in ways she was still trying to understand. "Actually," she said, surprising herself with her boldness, "I think I'd like to stay a little longer. There are some people I'd like to talk to." Daniel's face broke into a grin, recognizing the confidence in her voice that had carried them through their darkest years. As the sun set over Chicago, casting long shadows through the Academy's stained glass windows, Margaret O'Brien sat surrounded by her new community. The baby photo was still in her purse, but now it was joined by business cards, phone numbers, and invitations to future events. The woman who had been told she didn't belong had found her place at last. "Some uniforms are stitched by factories," she reflected, as she watched Daniel laugh with his classmates. "Others are woven from sacrifice, thread by thread, choice by choice, day by day. Some heroes wear medals, while others wear second-hand clothes, and carry the weight of 1,000 silent victories." In that moment, every soul in the room understood a fundamental truth. The strongest warriors are not always those who fight on distant battlefields. Sometimes they are the ones who survive life's quietest wars and still love louder than any applause. They had told her she didn't belong, but destiny whispered back that she had built this place with her pain, and today she reigned in it with pride. Congratulations, type 9 in the comments, so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.